use less, use longer, use again, and make clean.
So all of you Chartered Environmentalists, get round the office tomorrow morning and have a look. Have you got segregated bins for those key target materials? And the reason we want them segregated is because if you put food waste in with cardboard and paper, you're making it really hard for me to do anything other than create paper mache.
Welcome to the Society of the Environment EnvCast, where we feature special guests highlighting an environment top 5 each month. Each month, we welcome 2 environmental professionals to explore what they believe to be the top 5 things to consider within a particular topic. Topics range from climate to leadership, agriculture to AI, and everything in between. Look out for some curveballs in the top 5 each month, and remember, we can't cover every important thing within a topic. Our aim is to uncover how you can be part of the solution, to learn from the experts, and to sometimes think outside of the box as we strive for a sustainable future. Enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome back to another EnvCast Environment Top 5, this time focusing on the massive topic of waste. And an extra layer of excitement was added in the last episode when waste was mentioned alongside the use of lasers. And in what scenario are lasers not excited? So, well, I'm expecting similar levels of excitement throughout this one. But first, I'm Phil from the Society for the Environment and your podcast host for today. As always, I will be having a good chat with 2 registered environmental professionals and exploring key topics from different perspectives to expand our collective knowledge and ultimately make more impact. To look into the top 5 things for professionals across sectors to consider in and around the topic of waste, we are joined by 2 Chartered Environmentalists. Their biographies are in the podcast description, but as an extremely short introduction, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Adam Reed, MBE, Chartered Environmentalist via membership of the Chartered Institution of Waste Management, or CIWM for short, and he is the Chief Sustainability and External Affairs Officer at Suez UK. We also have Dr. Jane Gilbert, Chartered Environmentalist, also via CIWM, and founder of Carbon Clarity. So a very warm welcome to you both. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. So let's get straight into the top 5. We will alternate between our Chartered Environmentalist guests, Adam and Jane, for the first 4. And then the final item is for them to agree as the top thing to consider in the world of waste, a key takeaway for our listeners. So, number 1, I'm handing straight over to Jane to talk about the circular economy. But first, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself for context.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Jane Gilbert, and I've worked in the waste and resources sector. And I think that's where in the introduction there, Phil, you said we're talking about waste, but I think both Adam and I would agree that we're both talking about resources here, managing resources. So I've worked in the sector for 30 years now, principally dealing with organic waste through composting, anaerobic digestion, dealing with standards, and more recently, I've been working with plastics, working with BSI, British Standards Institution, and involved in quite a number of different global projects. For my sins as well, I'm also the Vice Chair of the Scientific and Technical Committee with the International Solid Waste Association, representing CIWM, and I've also been involved in a number of their projects over the years, including their task force on resource management a decade ago now, where we were looking in and deep diving into different aspects of the circular economy. The circular economy is now receiving a lot of interest from a wide range of different stakeholders, looking to really move away from what we've historically been a make, take, use, dispose, linear value chain, and looking to circularize that in many different ways. It's looking to use resources more effectively. It's looking to reuse resources and to recycle them. I think one of the best descriptions that I've found with regards to the circular economy is use less, use longer, use again, and make clean. So it's all about having an economy that in theory at least, is in harmony with the natural boundaries and the limits that we have within our Earth system. However, that utopia, that vision is an awful long way from reality at the moment. And we are really dictated, I think, to a certain extent by the number of goods and services which are now being offered to us as consumers. And they seem to be increasing year on year. We can look at plastics, for example, and if we look at the per capita use of plastics from when plastics were first brought into effect in sort of the 1950s and made available to consumers, every year we were only using something like about 200 grams. Now we're in the kilogram range, and our daily and annual use of plastics as individuals, global individuals, as citizens, is increasing year on year. So we've got a big change that actually needs to be made there if we are to start to circularize, start to use less, use for longer, and recycle what we then can't use, making them into more products again, rather than relying on final sinks and disposal routes. For me, I think we're seeing Europe that is now moving forwards with its Circular Economy Act, or its proposed Circular Economy Act. But we're really flagging behind, I think, in the UK, which is hindered, probably from a personal point of view at least, by the fact that each of the four nations has its own waste strategy and its own regulations and policies with regards to developing and implementing a circular economy. We've got that fragmentation there, which isn't particularly helpful when, for example, we do need to see elements brought in like deposit return schemes, extended producer responsibility, and these fiscal, these policies, these economic policies that need to be in place to start to reuse and to maximize recycling. So I think we've got a fragmented picture in the UK that I think Chartered Environmentalists could do a lot to start to address. But for me, ultimately, even with some macroeconomic drivers in place, ultimately a circular economy is dictated largely by the price of crude oil, because most of the products and the services that we use are dependent on oil-based goods, oil-based services. Just got to look at the laptop I'm using today to speak to you guys. It's all made of plastic largely. Most of the products we buy, the food we buy, the clothes we wear are all plastic made. And when it is so cheap to manufacture, and we have dedicated global supply chains in place for these goods, it's very difficult to start to implement other aspects whilst the price of continuing to produce them and producing them at faster rates and encouraging us to buy more and more goods daily, weekly, as we're being targeted to do, is a big challenge. It's not insurmountable, but it's a big challenge. And I think there's some big picture thinking that needs to be done in addition to the smaller on-ground grassroots level activism that is going on to help repair items locally, reuse items locally, have repair shops and local hiring for items that will only ever be used infrequently. So we've got a lot of work to do.
I feel like there's a lot to unpack there already, but it's certainly
Absolutely.
an interesting summary and some propositions of challenges and potential. You said it wasn't insurmountable, so there's potential there. And one thing I picked up on, I was scribbling notes very quickly there. There's lots of things there. are we coming back around in terms of the circular economy approach? Because back in numerous decades ago, things were repaired and things were used again and again and again. And that's not happening now. Are we trying to get back to that? Are we not going back in time, but it's more of a way of thinking in terms of a consumer?
I think it's a bit more complex than that, Phil.
Yep.
I think we are the cost of manufacturing goods now relative to the cost decades ago, say 50 years ago, the cost now, relatively speaking, has dropped massively. Mm-hmm. We have dedicated global supply chains in place now, which we didn't have then. The rate at which technology is advancing has also increased massively as well. We've just got to look at the IT sector, for example, mobile phones, computer chips, and, even the development of new quantum chips that will be sort of, starting to surface as well. We're seeing that rate of change changing very hugely from where we were 50 years ago. So we can't really say we're comparing like with like in that respect. But just looking at the goods we use, we can be starting to develop goods that can be repaired. We can start to develop goods that don't become obsolete as quickly as they are. At the moment, I buy my mobile phone and my laptop as refurbished tech from a refurbished tech online platform. And they've been great. No problem. But where I've run into difficulties with them is that the operating software has become obsolete. Yeah. So I've recently had to upgrade my phone simply because Apple no longer supported the iOS operating software that it was using. So the app stopped working and it was vulnerable then to security reasons.
Is it designed to be that way? That's a question. Interesting. One thing I also noted is that you mentioned that we're not necessarily getting it right in the UK. There'll be people who listen to this around the world. Is anybody doing it well at the moment? Do you know? I'm putting you on the spot here. Or is any particular sector doing it well so far? Or have we got we've got a long way to go for everyone?
In essence, to move these things along, and I know Adam is working in a far more commercial environment than I am, but where there is regulation, where there is long-term strategic regulation, that then provides a good framework for investment, for private sector investment and private sector innovation. And the EU in particular has been very good at doing that over the last 20, 30 years. We saw the effect that the landfill directive, for example, had when that was introduced in 1999. It has changed landfilling practices, at least within the UK, massively. It has helped transform the way in which we manage waste because there was the regulation in place for investment. There was the regulatory framework in place that we knew wasn't just going to be taken away with a new change of government. It transcended those 4 or 5 year cycles of general elections and local governments. And I think sort of over the last 10 years or so, we've lost that strategic focus. And with it being in, and with there being fragmentation and devolution within the 4 nations, there hasn't really been a coherence there to the extent that it could have been. Scotland, has a circular economy strategy in place. Wales has got targets for recycling in place, which has really helped increase their recycling rates massively, such that Wales is, one of the global leaders in recycling policies. And we've seen how that is where they've got regulations and a regulatory framework in place, change will happen because the private sector will therefore be able to invest, will be able to reduce their investment risks and actually move forward. And I feel that as the UK as a whole and England where I live, which is about 83% of the population, therefore 83% of the waste, broadly speaking, we've sort of lost that. It's been down to voluntary targets, and that's just too big a risk for big long-term investments. That's my humble opinion on it, really.
Okay, makes sense. We like your opinions. It's good. It's good to hear. Adam, I'm very aware that you probably have a lot to say around circular economy, but in terms of time, are you happy for me to segue into topic number 2?
If you let me just a couple of things,
Please
just
do.
briefly, because I think there's some really interesting. I think the circular economy is the big picture here. Everything else we talk about is probably a subset of this big mindset economic shift. But I think if you want to go and see circular economy in action, or you want to go and read a strategy that makes sense, look at Japan, look at South Korea. I'd argue the Dutch, the Danes are not bad, and the European Union's got some very good policies that are just starting to be implemented now. So lots that you can go and have a look at that would make sense, because everything Jane said is absolutely right. This idea of linear models and use and abuse and chuck it away or single use, it's ludicrous in a world that has now realised, and I think you said, should we go back? No, but we've now realised that one planet living is the only way you stay on planet Earth. Once the resources are gone, they've gone. And so things that go round more and are designed to go round more are the future. But it's, for me, the cheapness of everything is the fundamental problem. And that'll bring us on to point number 2 very nicely in a moment. But I think we're moving to, it's not darning your socks and patching your jacket. I mean, that's part of it, but that's not really the future. The future is stuff that's designed as a service. So buying a pair of jeans that that literally change with you over the years, and when they need to be, mended, they get mended. When they, if you put on too much weight, they go back to the store and you get ones with a different waistband. And I'm kind of starting to think my relationship with stuff has to change. And therefore I become a service user again, which is what we are in the UK. We're service users rather than a buyer of stuff, because that's so 1980, isn't it? Buy stuff and have a wardrobe of stuff. You don't need stuff. You need a nice outfit because you've got a big date coming up. So you go and hire the outfit and it goes back the next day, and you don't have all the rigmarole of what do I do when I've spilt some red wine on it or whatever. I just think there's an evolution coming that actually my son and the generation that's coming through schools now is probably much more geared up to understanding, because they're on Vinted or they're on eBay or they're living on platforms in a way that Jane and I weren't brought up on platforms. I mean, I didn't have a mobile phone, so it is a different space, I think. And
platforms were in, Adam. Platforms were in, but they were in
very different
version. But
they were
very different. Yeah. Sorry, I'm objecting.
And I think if you look at what's going on in England politically, though, I think Labour government have put a circular economy task force in place. They've got out to the great and the good in industry, so it's not civil servants sitting in a dark room, which has always been my criticism of policy generally. And they've gone, how do we grow the economy and deliver circularity and therefore resource efficiency? And where do we where do we target? So do we look at textiles first? Do we look at packaging? Should we be going after electricals? Where's the value chains that we can really influence? So I think come early 2026, when we see that strategy in place, I think it'll feel very different from the waste strategies of the past that you've seen in England, and even the recycling-based strategies that you've seen in Wales. So I'm hopeful that there's some transition thinking coming.
But what a challenge, changing the way consumers think. But at this stage, I'm very pleased I'm wearing my 10-year-old headphones. So this is good. This is a good look. Having said that, I promised excitement like lasers, and so far we've talked about 70s platforms. So interesting. We can work on that. Adam briefly mentioned it, but we're going to move on to topic number 2, which is emissions trading, which sounds like we're trading with thin air. But I'm going to hand over to Adam to expand on this topic. And before that, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm a proud Chartered Environmentalist and a fellow of the Chartered Institution of Waste Management, and a lifelong waster. Although my career has probably reflected the way the sector has evolved. So, I was a recycling officer back in the 90s. I got a PhD in policy failure. I moved into consulting, where I started to look at different technologies for, I guess, reducing our reliance on landfill initially, and then cleaning up society. And now I work for one of the largest resource management companies in the world, working out how we can, I guess, not only innovate new solutions, but also join dots with our customers so that somebody's problem over here becomes somebody's solution over there. And I think that's part of the circular economy is not only getting the design right, but it's also recognizing that there are value chains that just don't talk. And if we can help move materials in the right way, we can join some really important dots that are going to at least help us on the transition to a more resource efficient UK. But the question at hand, I guess, is emissions trading, and that is the least sexy topic we're going to talk about today, I can guarantee. But it's, for me, quite fundamental because, as Jane alluded to, the price of oil has so determined the ability to recycle plastic. You know, one day recycling plastic makes a lot of sense and is huge investment. The next day we're closing down plants all over the UK because the price of oil's plummeted and there is no point trying to make secondary resources out of plastic. So unless you force that material through the value chain, you're really fighting the economic tide, and therefore stuff doesn't happen. So I guess what emissions trading, and it's been around for a while, it operates in the European Union, it operates in the UK slightly differently, but it's basically putting a carbon tax, for want of a better phrase, I'll keep it simple, on power producing sites, so cement kilns or energy from waste plants in a few years' time, but DRACs and other bodies like that, whatever your power production sites would have had a framework within which they were allowed to emit because they were generating positive energy for a UK PLC, but they start to be given allowances for what they can emit from a carbon perspective, and therefore the dirtier, older sites have a higher carbon footprint and therefore a higher tax burden than the cleaner, newer sites. And if you're working with a biomass, that would be considered a green energy, or if you're working on wind, green energy, whereas if you're working on coal, bad. So it's a very simplistic kind of tax, but the point is it's not one figure like the landfill tax. So you could see the landfill tax and you could go, I know what the figure is in 1999. I knew what it would be in 2022. I knew what it would be in 2015. And you could start to escalate and go, critical point of infrastructure delivery is 6 years from now, because that's when the price of landfill was going to be so much more expensive than anything else. Well, with carbon pricing, it fluctuates, which means the certainty for investment is never quite as obvious. But what we can tell is that very quickly, energy from waste plants, which come into ETS in 2028 in full, will suddenly have a 50, 60, maybe £100 tax burden for every ton of carbon they emit. And given that your average energy from waste plant, for every ton of waste going in, a ton of carbon comes out the chimney, you can quickly see that those 400,000 ton energy from waste plants in the UK are going to have a very, very large bill. And that very, very large bill is going to go straight back to the people producing the material coming into the sites, which means mostly local government, which means some of my local authority customers are currently looking at an additional £8 to £15 million bill just for their emissions trading allowances. Now, that's a stark reality check for an authority that's currently going through austerity. It's worried about resources and staffing and everything else that's going on in our political economic climate. And so this is an unbudgeted massive risk to the fundamental operation of local government. So don't get me wrong, I think it's absolutely the right thing to do, and it's why Europe's done the same, because it gives a very clear market message that these types of technology with these types of fuel types are just unacceptable in a clean, green world. So very clear market mechanism, albeit it fluctuates a bit and it's therefore slightly more complex to map your way through. But what it's enabled me to do, and we've just issued a report a couple of weeks ago looking at the opportunities through ETS, emissions trading in the UK, because I think what it's doing for me is it's given me a reason to talk to my big municipal customers. And I'm saying to them, 2 years from now, your residual waste, your black bag waste, your non-recyclable waste, the stuff that your people aren't segregating currently, are all going to a thing that burns, and they're all going to suddenly have an extra 40, 50, 60 pounds per ton incurred that you haven't budgeted for. So my question to them is, what can we do together to change that? Can we look at source segregation of target materials, plastics, organics, for example, textiles? Can we look at the efficiency of the system currently Or is it an opportunity to put in, pre-sorting at the energy from waste plant so that you have a good look at what comes in before it goes in the bunker? Something that historically you wouldn't do because that would just be additional cost. Well, now suddenly there's a very good financial reason to do so, and we could do that collaboratively. And of course, what it also does, it gives us an economic model where we can now actually test whether carbon capture on the back end of an energy from waste plant is financially viable without government subsidy. Because at least with carbon capture, yes, you'd pay your bill for ETS because you've processed the waste, but the carbon capture would mean you're not actually releasing the carbon at all. You're capturing it and there's a value in it. So you could start to look at, the economic trading of the value of carbon at any one point in time. So for me, it's a massive, massive risk to the economics of the system, but that's exactly what it needs to be, because it's got to be that kind of shock to the system in order for it to drive the kind of fundamental conversations that Jane's already alluded to for circularity. If we're not seeing the reality of a harsh economic climate, then I don't think you get many of the changes that we need upstream. And I think ETS is one of the big sticks that will drive change in the way that we think about the materials that we're having to handle. And unfortunately, it's a little bit blunt, but maybe it needs to be blunt because we've had 30 years of trying to get recycling to work and it just hasn't got there. It's plateaued.
Time to make a change. Yeah. I'm fascinated that both topics so far have really had a focus on economics and the cost of things and future costs and so on. Is that surprising in any way?
No, not really.
No.
I think economics drives the world, doesn't it? It's if I haven't got money, I can't spend it. I don't buy stuff. And if you look at what's in the bin, I'm always fascinated. I mean, I'm a bit of a bin diver. Maybe don't get my hands as dirty as I used to, but looking at people's generation is fascinating because when the economic recession really started to hit a few years back, you started to see that in certain geographies, certain material streams are just not in the bin anymore because they're expensive product types. So you see, milk doesn't drop, wine bottles drop, glass fluctuates wildly with the economic status of the UK economy.
Does it?
Plastics doesn't. Plastics convenience. So lots of plastic stays in your bin, irrespective of what's going on in the economy.
Okay.
If I can just say something there, Phil, to sort of add on to what Adam's just said, that depending on the price of oil, this will help drive whether or not we're going for more circular solutions, more recycled products, or whether we're just going to manufacture them separately. Having worked in the organic sector for a long time, shortly after the 2008 crash, when the price of oil shot up to well above $150 a barrel, some even spot rates were in the $200 a barrel remit, farmers were starting to use recycled compost and anaerobic digestate as sources of nitrogen and phosphorus, because it was cheaper for them to use these materials to put onto their land rather than to buy in nitrogen-based fertilizers. And nitrogen-based fertilizers in particular carry a very, very high CO2 cost, because the Haber-Bosch process of actually manufacturing ammonium from nitrogen and hydrogen is very energy intensive. And I think the manufacture of nitrogen-based fertilizers, this is just the manufacture, accounts for somewhere between about 2 and 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions globally. It's a massive, massive emitter. If you then add on overuse and release of nitrous oxide from the fields because they're used inappropriately, we're looking at sort of 4 or 5% of total greenhouse gas emissions. It's a massive, massive issue. So when the price of oil was high, the price of nitrogen-based fertilizers shot up as well, as you'd expect. Farmers started to then use composts, anaerobic digestate on their fields. Of course, as soon as the price dropped down again and the spot rate dropped, they reverted back to what they used to. And we haven't seen swings in the price of crude oil since then to the extent that it was in 2008. So that just shows, just one example there, how the knock-on effect to actually help use recycled products, quality assured recycled products. I'm not talking about rubbish. I'm talking about good quality assured, quality controlled materials, manufactured to published standards. But that helped drive that part of the economy. And unfortunately, it's gone flat again. And it's still an uphill struggle for the manufacturers to actually sell the materials that they're producing, and it doesn't reflect adequately the nutrients, let alone the carbon and the soil organic matter potential improvements that can be achieved and that the materials contain. So economics, I'd say macroeconomics, the cost of goods, the cost of oil, but also coupled with the legislative framework as well, and the political will are all needed.
And such wide impacts as well. You gave the example of agriculture there and the costs involved in that, and clearly some of that gets passed on to the consumers, and things fluctuate in terms of the costs. So, but we're covering a lot, but we've got a lot yet to cover. So on to topic number 3, if that's okay. We're going to go back to Jane, the mysterious Global Plastics Treaty. So what's that about? And put bluntly, why does it matter?
Well, why it matters, I've just been talking about compost and digestate, and why it matters is that plastic has it's such a good product in so many respects because it hangs around. It's got very good functionality. It doesn't fall apart. It doesn't it doesn't degrade very easily. So it hangs around for a long time. But it's a real big problem for organic waste recyclers trying to remove plastic out of organic waste streams and out of their products. And plastic product is a big issue. It's a particular issue in many, many countries that don't have adequate waste collection and containment and disposal, recycling. Parts of the global south, Southeast Asia in particular, and a lot of attention has been focused on the effects of plastics in the aquatic environment, oceans, and of course that's where Ellen MacArthur founded her foundation, because of all the plastic she saw swirling around in the Pacific when she was sailing there. So the Global Plastics Treaty has been initiated by the United Nations Environment Programme, by UNEP, in about 2022, and its aim is to reach a legally binding agreement with countries to end plastics pollution. And I think most countries will agree that that is a worthwhile, a very valuable reason for having something in place. But the devil's in the detail. The Global Plastics Treaty is supposed to take into account the whole life cycle of plastics, which will include all the upstream polymer manufacture, the midstream, forming that into products, and then the distribution, then the downstream end use, disposal and recycling. And if we're just looking at greenhouse gas emissions, I think about over 60, probably 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions actually come during the manufacture of plastic products themselves. So if we're just looking about emissions that that Adam's just been talking about in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, that and the manufacture of plastics is very, very intensive when we look at that. The latest negotiations, as far as I'm aware, we're looking very much at sort of end-of-pipe solutions, and a number of countries are saying, well, we don't need to reduce our manufacturing. What we do need to do is improve the collection, the containment, recycling, and the end-of-life waste management opportunities there. And yes, I agree with that to a certain extent, but what that fails to take into account are a number of really, really important factors. The first is when we're looking at population increase. So if you start to map just population increase and current per capita consumption of plastics per person globally, averaged out amongst the whole globe, at the moment we are using about 450 million tons of plastics every year. Now, if we take into account population increase, that's going to increase. But like I mentioned earlier, we are also, as individuals globally, using more plastics every year because we are being encouraged to buy more different products made out of plastics, stuff that perhaps wasn't, new stuff coming along, new products. So the estimates suggest that coupled with population increase and increasing per capita use, if the trends continue as they have been over the last 30, 40 years, we're going to need to manufacture twice as much plastic by 2050, somewhere in the region of going from 450 million tons approximately today, sort of early 2020s, to about 976 million tons per annum by 2050. So it's over doubled. Now, somewhere along the line, that tap has to be not necessarily cut off, because certain plastics in the right place for the right products have transformed our lives. And, you know, I think any of us who end up in healthcare situations would wholly agree that we don't want to see, you know, people having to reuse syringes and certain, you know, healthcare products. Right. However, the tap certainly has to be closed significantly. And just looking at that and having a reliance on end-of-pipe solutions, without a doubt, there's about just under 40% of the global population don't have access to adequate waste collection, waste disposal. That's in the Global Waste Management Outlook that was published last year, UNEP publication. So certainly by putting in place proper collection systems, by engaging with local communities, by having localized recycling, and by having safe disposal where recycling can't be put in place, that is one aspect. But we all know that's never 100% effective, and there will always be leakage into the environment. And just necessarily, if we're producing twice as much plastic with the same rate of leakage as we're having now, there's going to be twice as much entering the environment and polluting the environment. Yep. So there's some really thorny issues here that the INC, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, really needs to get grips of when it next convenes. And I'm not sure when that date's going to be as yet. I'm not aware that that's been set as of today. But these are really important aspects that the committee needs to look at. I know there's been a lot of preparatory work that's been done on that front, a lot of work behind the scenes. But until we start to see a reduction in the amount of plastics manufactured globally and start to see much better circularity of the plastics that are already in circulation, the overall aim of reducing plastic pollution, given our trajectory of the plastics, continuing to grow, to increase, that's going to be a very hard challenge, a very hard square to circle, if that's probably not the wrong metaphor to use, but that's what we are in a nutshell.
In a nutshell, well, it sounds complex. I mean, global treaties are always pretty complex, aren't they? But as you mentioned, I guess a global treaty will help towards turning the tide. That's the general idea, isn't it?
I think it's the general idea. And once again, if that's legally binding, as Adam has said, it's going to provide a framework for investment. We have a very poor plastics recycling sector in the UK. There's areas of innovation, there's areas of excellence, without a doubt. I don't want to poo-poo it all, but we don't have the capacity that we're going to need to recycle and to repurpose a lot of that plastic waste that the UK is going to be producing. And with simpler recycling regulations coming in, and the need to start collecting the flexibles, 100, 150 tons, whatever that's, going to be, we're probably going to end up having to export some of that in the short to medium term because the investment and the infrastructure is just not there.
Okay. Adam, anything to add?
Well, it's a good segue onto materials more generally, which I think is really important that we get there. But just to say, I think global treaties are important, but we also have to recognise the global lobby from some of these chemical companies and some of those embedded in the plastics chain really did show their teeth, I think, behind the scenes in that last round of negotiations. So was I surprised that they kind of stalled? Not really, because there's a lot of vested interest and an economic system at play here, but that doesn't mean the intention to reduce consumption of certain material streams like plastics, and to recognise that we need every nation to move on this, because this is not China, the US, and Europe can do it on their own, because they can't, because everybody else is moving down that plastic front anyway. So I think it's an important challenge, but one that's going to be a thorny road for several years to come.
Yeah. Do we need a global treaty to just get on with it? I
think every country's getting on with it anyway. I mean, I think that part of the problem is we're putting our solutions in place. I think the worry will be when you start to look at, I guess the global south, for want of a phrase. I think where plastics are becoming so obvious as a stream of litter and waste now, that we can't expect, and let's be honest, so much material gets exported from Europe these days. You can track it all around the world. So the system is not fit for purpose, that's for sure.
Yeah. And I wonder if the media hype around the global treaty not necessarily working might not encourage the public and so on to be infused by it all, even if regions and countries are actually getting on with it. It's just not necessarily the headline figures. Interesting. Okay. Topic number 4 of today's waste or resources focused EnvCast, I'm learning, is all about the rollout of the simpler recycling scheme, which was briefly mentioned in that last topic. Over to Adam to tell us more.
It was, and I'm going to do this really quickly because I'd like to think, that all your chartered environmentalists around the world are going, we get it. We've seen the advert. We've heard about the policy. We've got some new bins, bags, or boxes in the office or whatever it might be. So simple recycling. The idea is, in England anyway, is that we basically have the same 5 core materials ready for collection from home, from work, and wherever you go to play. And the idea is you can't get that confusion that at home I can recycle Tetra Pak cartons, and at work I can't, but I can do glass. And when I'm on the street, some high streets have got bins for recycling and some haven't. Well, the future's everywhere has the same set of material streams. Now, it doesn't mean you're all getting the same boxes or the same bags or the same colour containers. We're not going super consistent, but it does mean when you're at work, because this came into force as of the 1st of April 2025, when you're at work, there's an obligation on all businesses to segregate, in England that is, to segregate these core materials. Actually, in Wales and Scotland, they've already been doing this for a year or two. So have you got your glass separated? Have you got your cardboard and paper segregated? Weekly food waste collection from your business, even if you don't have a big canteen, there's still the service provision. What materials? And of course the plastics system as well, and then aluminium cans and steel cans should you have them. And the idea is, if everybody's got the same, we reduce any of that uncertainty. We capture a higher proportion of those target materials from every interface point, whether you're at home, work, or play, and therefore we start to get recycling rates back up and moving again, which I think is a very laudable, credible thing to be doing. Those of us that worked in the industry a long time have always said that the confusion when you live here, work there, go shopping over there, and you frequent your mum's at the weekends is just, I've no idea what goes where. Well, now in theory, it's the same materials, even if it's a different colour bin or box. So I'd like to think, a lot of people are going to be getting this right. However, we've been live for several months now, and I can guarantee you that most businesses don't know what simpler recycling is, have no idea that they're operating illegally, haven't got 4 or 5 bins outside their premises, and certainly haven't got the same bins inside their offices. So all of you chartered environmentalists, get round the office tomorrow morning and have a look. Have you got segregated bins for those key target materials? And the reason we want them segregated is because if you put food waste in with cardboard and paper, you're making it really hard for me to do anything other than create paper mache. And it's just the same with your plastics and your tins. Those two things can be sorted at some of my plants. But if your tins have got liquid in them and you put them in with your paper, suddenly by the time it gets to my plant, that paper has been degraded to a point where recycling isn't really an option. So this is all about giving us an ability to get better quality material more often through the chain. And why is that important? Because as of next April in 2026, every household in England will have to be complied with this segregation, which means if you're currently commingling everything, you're going to probably see some change to your bin provision, or at least some education material coming around explaining to you why there isn't a change to your bin provision because you've got a decent sorting system or whatever. But you will get a food waste collection. And let's be honest, most households in England don't have a food waste collection currently. So there is a big shift coming.
Interesting. Well, I hope that'll be good for me because for some reason, my family and friends think because I work for an environmental organisation, I know exactly what goes in and out of their bins, and I have not got a clue. So hopefully this might at least help me with that and sound more knowledgeable, which is always a bit of a challenge, especially when you live on basically the border of 3 counties and every county have different, I don't know, I'm just not sure.
Consistency's got to be key in this, hasn't it? Make it easy for my mum to get it right most of the time. That's the aim.
Exactly. Jane, anything to say on the simpler recycling system?
No, not really. But I think one of the aspects that if we go back to the circular economy, this is all about making the UK, and I'll talk about the UK, although I know simpler recycling is only for England, much more self-sufficient. Because what we're doing is we're actually losing valuable resources. It's not just waste. And people being asked to segregate are perhaps not as aware that a lot of these materials we're having to import in. And that means that we have some pretty significant security issues in terms of the materials. Most of our we don't really manufacture many upstream plastics, the granules, the resins. We probably do a bit on Teesside, but we still import the plastics into the UK. So if we're going to manufacture in the UK and keep our resources in the UK, we don't want to be exporting that or losing that. The same in particular comes with the waste electronic and equipment. With all the valuable earth metals that are in there, the valuable resources that are actually in there that are really mined in certain parts of the world. Lithium, for example, as well, lithium-ion batteries, mined in certain parts of the world, but mostly converted in China. So we have sort of some critical resource issues there that by recycling and by looking after those resources and ensuring that they, as Adam's just described, that they're kept separate and they are actually effectively recycled, we're helping to ensure that the UK is as sufficient as it can be and less subject to geopolitical instability, which, at the moment is potentially a large threat at the moment. I'll just go on to organics very quickly and the food waste. At the moment, phosphorus is a critical resource material. There are only a few places in the world where it's mined. we don't have any mines in the UK, but it's absolutely fundamental for us growing our food. So from a food security issue, it's really important that we actually keep on to that phosphorus, and we don't just wash it down the drains for it to be lost in our river courses, or that it's not just going to be lost in landfills or even in incinerators, waste to energy plants, where it can't easily be recovered. What we want to do is ensure that that phosphorus is retained, recycled and reused back on farmers' fields to grow more crops. So there's there's a massive food security issue there as well. So, all of these things, all have a reason. And I think, recycle for Britain, because it's making us as a country stronger, is probably a message that we do start to need to get across to individuals, to businesses, because it's not just about, we're doing it for the environment or because government's telling us to. It's actually helping us as a country be a lot more self-reliant and less subject to geopolitical instability.
Well, there's a message that can be condensed onto a good poster, I think. Excellent stuff.
I like the slogan.
And in the bottom, stop sending Adam paper mache. That's what we need. Brilliant. I jest, but very good point. Very good points. Let's move on to the final item, which is the biggest takeaway you want listeners to be considering, apart from everything we've already said, which I think there are some serious takeaways there. What top tips and advice would you like to impart? Who would like to start this one?
Well, I'll start just quickly, because I think there's so much change happening right now. My message to Chartered Environmentalists is embrace it, because there's roles for green careers, green jobs for me at the moment is my pet topic, because there's just so much expansion happening. If we're going to process materials in the UK, if we're going to change the behavior of millions of householders and businesses, if we're going to be entrepreneurial and create new packaging formats that are designed for repair or refill, if we're going to be even more entrepreneurial about the business models around service provision, all of these things suggest to me that there are huge opportunities. And some of the reports that CIWM have published over the last few years suggest that the resources and waste sector is about to triple in size over the next sort of 10 to 15 years. So I think if this is a space that's interesting, I can't see it being anything but full on for the next 10 years as we address carbon, as we address biodiversity, as we address UK markets, as we address circularity, as we address recycling materials quality, and as we address everybody going, isn't this a bit like during the war? And I think that's really fascinating, because it's a bit of a closed loop and it's a bit of a reinvention. But actually, we've got to be more resilient, and our economy can grow by looking after our own resources. But it means people having to make some interesting decisions, and we need to help them make those interesting decisions.
Globally, I assume, as well.
Of course.
Yeah.
But we've got to go first and lead the way.
Yeah, and if we can support Chartered Environmentalists and environmental professionals to spearhead that, then we certainly will. Anything to add, Jane?
Yeah, absolutely agree with Adam. Huge potential out there. But I think really, if we are going to start to embrace it, we really do need to start putting a price on carbon, not just on the carbon that ends up in the atmosphere in an oxidized form as CO2, starting to value the carbon that is in all the goods and that help support the services that we use. Absolutely. And really starting to see how some change in our macroeconomic environment is going to help drive that by providing the stability, the opportunities for investment, and then all the things that Adam has just described as well. We need a multi-pronged attack, but for me, it's getting that macroeconomy, those macroeconomic drivers in place.
Exciting.
It is exciting. There's a lot to do.
Absolutely.
With all of these podcasts that we're doing, there's a lot to do. But there's a lot going on already, isn't there? There's so much more potential.
You wouldn't want to be bored, would you?
No. I'll be out of a job. But some fascinating insights. And there's a lot of stuff that people should get involved in, whether you're currently in the waste and resources world, or, I mean, everyone is linked to that, surely.
Yep.
And we need environmental professionals to make a stand and make a difference through innovation and so on. Very well articulated by Adam. So that brings our podcast to a close for today. So thank you very, very much to our guests, Adam and Jane. We've covered a lot. And if you, the listener, have ideas of what could have been mentioned in our waste or indeed resources top 5, then let us know in the YouTube comments. We're always keen to keep the conversation going. I'm sure Adam and Jane won't mind you connecting with them on LinkedIn or something like that. And finally, please check out any links and resources in the pod description to keep on learning. Thank you again. And I'll see you in the next episode next month. If you've made it this far, please remember to subscribe wherever you're listening to this episode so you don't miss the next one. Also, rate our podcast and leave a comment to help us reach more people. Thank you very much for listening or watching on YouTube. We look forward to the next episode next month. See you then.